So in 1971, Phil Knight, who at the time was the co-founder of Nike, was in search for a new logo for his company. And he contracted graphic design student Carolyn Davidson to create what we now know as the Nike Swoosh. He paid Carolyn $35, and in Carolyn's perspective, the logo represented Nike, which is the Greek goddess of victory. So on today's podcast, I want to talk about whether or not Carolyn Davidson was underpaid for the $35 that she received for making the logo of a company that would go on to be worth billions. So was she underpaid? Let's get into it. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Theory of Why. My name is Rob Johnson. So the mission of this podcast is to help business owners, leaders, and entrepreneurs think about ways to solve problems creatively. And one of those ways is by simply asking why, doing some discovery work, learning a little bit more about how things work before we execute a solution. So a few housekeeping tips, as this is episode 1 and this is kind of our first interaction together. So first thing, this podcast is going to be weekly. It's going to be dropping every Wednesday at 5 a.m. on all of your favorite platforms. There will be guests from time to time from all walks of life, whether they're known or unknown. And the purpose of the guests on this show isn't to promote what they have going on or to give, service to their business. That'll come passively, I'm sure. But largely, the purpose of guests on this program is going to be to help shape areas of this conversation that I'm just simply unaware of. I don't know all the things. I don't want to pretend to. So having guests in to talk about areas that I'm not experienced in, I think is going to give a better listening experience for you. And last but not least, the organization helping us keep the lights on for this podcast is KeyBank Corporation. So KeyBank has partnered with us to be the title sponsor for this podcast, and we're excited to have them along for the ride. More on them later in this episode. So let's talk about this. So was Carolyn Davidson paid fairly? Now, the job reportedly had taken her 17 and a half hours, and she agreed to a wage of $2 per hour. Now, anytime we talk about wages and what someone's paid, there's always going to be ardent proponents of both sides. So she was paid fairly, she wasn't paid fairly. And what tends to happen, especially when people are a lot less thoughtless when it comes to debate, is people hear their buzzwords for whatever topic they're most passionate about, and they immediately dive in. And for me, as someone who really likes to debate, I really like to understand both sides of the situation before I dive in. So a really helpful tip for me that I follow is anytime I hear someone's position on something, I like to ask a series of questions to better understand their opinion. And the reason why I do this is, one, I'm sure we've all been in a conversation before where someone says something and you immediately jump on it and you're attacking them. And they say, well, hold on, slow down. That's not what I meant. And that derails the whole conversation because now you have to back up, reassess what they said, they have to clarify, and then you can continue the discussion. What I prefer to do is ask those clarifying questions first so I can understand the topic better. So 3 questions I want to ask about this particular situation is, 1, what year did this happen? And as I said in the opening, it happened in 1971. 2, what was the minimum wage in 1971? It was $1.60 an hour. And 3, what was Carolyn's level of experience at the time that she commissioned this logo? And she was a graphic design student, so I wouldn't classify her as a graphic design professional, as she didn't have a ton of experience in field yet. So let's look at the data. So she was paid $2 an hour. It took her 17 and a half hours to do the original artwork, and we'll put the artwork up on the screen as we're going along so you can take a look at what the original sketch looked like versus what the Nike logo looks like now. So on the graphic, you can see how the Nike logo has evolved over time. So from the 1971 rendition to where we're at now with just the swoosh, no text, no nothing, a very identifiable, recognizable logo. Now, I've seen a lot of research and journalism that's gone into this story, and I've seen some conflicting data. So I want to talk about that a little bit on today's podcast. And And the first thing that I want to talk about is this underlying question of the whole show. Was Carolyn paid fairly? And in my opinion, I think that anytime you go into work, right, you have a set wage. You say, hey, I'm paid this much. Here's how long I think it'll take. And then anytime the scope goes beyond that, I think as a professional or even as a college student, you need to, share the difference of that scope with the person that you're working for. So if you say, hey, I think it's going to take me 20 hours and you came in at 17 and a half, that's great. But if you're approaching the 20-hour mark and you're like, I'm not remotely done with this, it's going to take much longer, then by all means, share that with the client, let them know, tell them it's going to take me at least another 10 hours. Are you okay with that? Get the green light and then move forward. But in this case here, it took her 17 and a half hours. Now, if you look at the original sketch of the Nike logo, 17 and a half hours for the sketch seems like a long time to me. We have, graphic designers and people that work here at Wayne Media, and that seems like a long time. But again, you have a college student, not a lot of experience. So it's arguable whether or not it should have taken 17 and a half hours. But that was one point of contention I saw quite a bit online, which is like, why did it take so long? And good graphic design does take time, especially if you're going from sketch to concept to implementation. There's a lot of phases there that need to be worked out. Second is this rate of $2 per hour. One thing that I saw online that I thought was really interesting, and this is where I want to bring Johnny, who's our engineer, into the mix here, is Phil Knight agreed to the $2 per hour that he was willing to pay her. And one thing that I saw was people saying, well, Nike's $1 billion company. Why would they just pay someone $2 per hour? And what I think people are missing is they're thinking about Nike now, not Nike circa 1971. You have to remember, one story I really like is that in 1984, 1985, when Michael Jordan was, I think, in his second or third season of the NBA, it might have even been at the end of his first season, he was looking for a shoe sponsor. And the main ones that he was focusing on, I believe, were Converse and Adidas. Nike wasn't even at the table. It wasn't even a tier 1 shoe at the time. But they made a pitch, and it came out that he ended up going with Nike, and that's where the whole Air Jordan thing took off, and it exploded the brand. I forget the exact numbers, but they talked about it on The Last Dance. Like, they had some really small goal of like $4 million to sell in shoes. And I think it was like, I might get the data wrong, but it was over like 100 million that they sold in the first year just because of the popularity of the shoe. So Johnny, what's your top level thoughts on the the $2 per hour Carolyn Davidson situation?
Well, initially I'll think that she's paid over the minimum wage. I had no idea, that was that close to a minimum wage. The second thing I thought about right off the bat when you started talking a little bit about it was it just her, or did they open that up to several other people to design something and she just came up with the best design?
As far as I know, it was just her. And one thing that I've seen consistently is that Phil Knight didn't even like the logo. He was like, this is fine. We'll see what we can do with it. And then as they started developing more and more sneakers, they put just the swoosh on there, and they ended up it really grew on them. But initially, like when they got the work back, from what I gathered, they weren't even excited about it.
Yeah. And then my third thinking of it was, she was paid, over the minimum wage at that time. She agreed to work for $2 an hour, right? So to me, she kind of set her contract and they paid her what she did, right? But then again, I think also Nike is a huge corporation now. It wasn't back then. If I would have put a square box on there for a logo, would the shoe sell, or was it the logo that was selling?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good discussion. Is the branding and the style and the look of things does sell. And right now you're seeing, I think it's the Air Force One, the white Nikes with the black swoosh. Those are huge right now. And a big part of that is also the quality of the shoe. Nike was putting out some very quality sneakers that weren't falling apart. They weren't, your bargain bin sneakers. So when you have really good craftsmanship with really good brand, those things take off. Now, this gets me to the part of Carolyn's compensation that a lot of people do not know. So it's a very popular headline that she was paid $35 an hour. But in 1983, once Nike went public, they presented Carolyn with 500 shares of preferred Nike stock and a diamond encrusted swoosh ring. Now, this is where the controversy comes in, because I've seen at least 3 articles on both sides of this, and I'll tell you which one I think is accurate. So in 1983, those shares of Nike stock were valued at just over $1,000. In 2023, the estimate is either the common stock price, which right now would be trading at just over $60,000 for those 500 shares, or if it was a preferred stock, it's over $1 million in preferred shares. Now, this is where the debate kind of goes on both sides, and I've seen a lot more evidence that it's preferred stock. So at the end of the day, this logo that she designed, it took about 12 years for the company to go public. She was presented with a ring, 500 shares of stock, and she ended up earning just over $1 million in that stock as time progressed, which I think is pretty reasonable compensation. But this gets me back to where we're at, which is you need to understand the full scope of the story, because what people tend to want to do is they want to take one part of a story and say, I can't believe that Nike paid, this woman $35 for a logo of $1 billion company. Well, that's a very short way of telling that story, and there's a lot more to it.
So that raises another question for me, Rob.
Yeah.
Did she realize the stock, or did she sell the stock? Right? How long did she actually hold on to that stock?
She still holds it.
She still holds it to this day. Okay.
Yep. That's what I understand, is she still holds it to this day. And and again, the other thing too with her is that she ended up doing more and more graphic design projects with Nike, and her portfolio, which has this branding in it, has given her more and more work through this. So there's a lot of things that can come from work that isn't, and again, it's hard to say that this isn't even market rate. In 1971, based on what I was looking at on the wage data, to me, a college student being paid above minimum wage for graphic design work for a company that you have no idea if it's going to take off or not, I think she was paid fairly at the $35 rate. I can't see any evidence that that she was underpaid even for those times, considering who Nike was. In 1971, Nike hadn't even launched a shoe yet under their new name. Phil Knight had success with another company, but it wasn't Nike. This was a completely new venture for him and his partner, which I thought was, a really interesting, really interesting concept. So even at face value, when you look at the situation here, I don't believe that she was underpaid. And this is a really good lesson for business owners and specifically agency owners I want to talk to now, is you have to understand the value of the work that someone is doing, and both parties have to agree. Now, who has more responsibility in those negotiations? And for me, I think it's equal responsibility. The employee has to be just as accountable and able to stand up for themselves in a wage negotiation as the employer. They have to know what their worth is, and the employer has to know what their bottom line is. And if you can't come to an agreement, then it's not a good situation. No one's going to be happy. If you're the employee and you agree to a wage that you're not happy with, every day that you come to work, you're going to have the mentality that I'm being underpaid here, I'm being undervalued, and that's going to show through to your work. And on the employer side, if you overpay someone and they keep making mistakes, you're going to have the thought of, this person's overpaid, they're not worth it. Every small thing that you do, or that they do rather, is going to come back and make you think that they shouldn't be here. So that's why both sides need to agree and be completely fine with that pay structure, or you're going to have problems. You can see that a lot, especially in today's modern era, in my opinion. Restaurants and some of these jobs that largely employ younger people are in a position where before COVID, they could get people to come work for them for this amount, whatever that amount is. Post-COVID, when there was, the great resignation, the workforce was a little bit less. Employees have a lot more power for negotiation, and they can demand better wages. And for me, I think a lot of companies were exposed because they were paying people so low that they were getting away with it for a long time because the economic conditions were in their favor. And then once COVID happened, that script flipped on them. So now suddenly you can't pay someone $10 an hour for something and expect to get away with it because the market has moved beyond that. And I don't really want to get into the minimum wage discussion on this show. Episode 2, we're really going to focus on this and have some really good discussion and clips on this particular topic. But the main takeaway here is as you get into the negotiation period for an employer, you have to understand both sides of the table, and both sides of the table have to agree. So if Carolyn wasn't forced into this $2 an hour contract, it really doesn't matter what anyone thinks in terms of her being overpaid or underpaid because both sides agreed to it. Now, Nike exploded. So from a ethical perspective, do I think the ownership ought to recognize her as being a part of that brand and that growth? I absolutely do. And I think they did that with the preferred stock, with the ring, with constantly recognizing her for her contributions to the company. I think all of that is what they should have done, and I'm glad that they did. They weren't contracted to do that. They didn't have to do that. But I think from a business ethics point of view, that's what they should have done, and I'm glad they did. All right, so before I go too much farther on the show, I want to talk about our title sponsor, Key Bank. So Key Bank has been an excellent partner for us here at Wayne Media on the corporate side, helping us really understand what we ought to be doing as a business as we grow. One of the things I've liked the most about working with Key Bank is their personal approach to business, which I find doesn't exist a lot in the marketplace, at least for me. I haven't experienced that a whole lot, where people are actually interested in you and your growth as a business. The relationship isn't transactional. It's very much so relational. So whether you're looking for personal or business, I would take a look at key.com. They have excellent programs for corporations, and they have really good account setups for personal. So check them out at key.com. You can find more about them in the show notes. So I want to end the show on a recurring theme every week. And one, I want to focus on a particular business leader that has something to say, whether it's a short or a long quote on this topic. And today I thought it would be really good to talk about John C. Maxwell. So John Maxwell is obviously a phenomenal business leader, author, is prolific. And the quote that I found from him that I thought was the best representation of, how leaders ought to serve their people when it comes to wages and negotiations is John Maxwell says, "How do leaders serve their people? They may pay good wages and treat employees with respect." And this is a very simple quote. It's something that on the surface doesn't really hit you that hard, but when you consider the weight of paying good wages and treating employees with respect and what that looks like in a day-to-day mindset, that's a very heavy goal for a leadership team to take on, especially as your organization scales. So what does it mean to treat people with respect and to pay good wages? Those are things that need to be lived out daily within that particular organization. And I find that a lot of business owners say that they do things. They give lip service to quality and customer service and respect and integrity and honesty. And one of my favorite quotes from Simon Sinek in his book Start With Why is, if an organization has to write on their wall that they're honest, odds are they probably aren't. That's a paraphrase, but basically these things that you should expect from people should not be, what they list as what they do. Those things should be a given. So when you talk about, treating people with respect, or we're an honest organization, or we operate with integrity, those should be assumed and carried out in a daily fashion, not necessarily something that that you have to say you're doing so you can cover up the fact that you're not. So if you're not paying people good wages, I would start by defining what is good. Why do we pay people at what we pay them at? And a lot of people don't think that way. They think, what's the lowest I can pay someone to get away with that? I'll give you an example in my company here. So I have a lot of younger people that work for me. And some of the people that work for me still live at home. And I had a business owner tell me, he said, Rob, you're really lucky because you have people that work for you that live at home so you can pay them less. And that surprised me because I was sitting there thinking, in what world does someone's life circumstances dictate what I pay them? Shouldn't it be the job that they're doing? I can't look at someone and be like, oh, hey, I know that you're living at home. You told me that during the interview. I know your expenses aren't that high, therefore I can pay you less. If you operate with that as part of your business, let me tell you something. You won't have a business much longer. You don't operate and treat people that way. And the fact that I heard someone say that to me was just so surprising because not once does that ever factor into what I pay people is what their living situation is. So if someone comes in and they're like, hey, Rob, I just leased a Ferrari. It's like, man, I need to pay this guy more so we can afford that Ferrari. Like, that's not how it works. You have to understand exactly why you're paying someone what you're paying them. And you can't base it off of what's most advantageous for you as the business owner, or how can you, tip the scales in your favor and use someone's life circumstances as, the reason that you pay them the least amount. We have people here that probably don't have other opportunities in this county, at least because there's not a lot of agencies in this area. That doesn't mean just because we're the only game in town that does this, we can therefore pay people less. On the county average, we are above what the average wages for a small business are. And I'm happy about that. And there's a philosophy behind that. There's a reason behind that. But I feel like a lot of business owners, from the surveys I've read, articles and studies, the mindset is, how can I pay people the least amount possible so I can increase my bottom line? And that's just not how it should work. You have to think about retention, employee wellness, because it's very expensive to rehire and it's very expensive to have bad people on the team and to foster a culture that doesn't work out for your main partners, which is going to be your customers, your clients, vendors, whoever that may be. All of these things go into building culture. And when you start a relationship off on, boy, how can I pay people the least amount possible? You're going to be in a really bad situation in a short period of time. So please think about that. All right, last but not least, for me, something that I think is really valuable is biblical wisdom in terms of business. Now, obviously, we can all agree that the Bible wasn't written to be a business textbook, but I believe that there is a lot of wisdom and truth in the Bible that speaks to how to run a business, how to operate, and how to treat people. And the proverb I want to talk about today is Proverb 22:22. And it says, do not exploit the poor because they are poor, and do not crush the needy in court. Now, historically, it's been easy to take advantage of people who don't have means. You can certainly exploit people because they're struggling. And if they don't have the financial means for recourse, it makes it that much easier to step in and take advantage of people. And I've talked before publicly and on this podcast and my previous podcast, Waynecast, about how people and business owners have expressed things to me about, hiring younger people or hiring people who live at home or people in that effect, that you can pay them less or you don't have to pay them as much because, they don't have any means or other opportunities. And that's not how we need to look at people at all. We need to be able to judge and assess fairly what people ought to be paid. And we can't just use loopholes like, well, they don't have any recourse or they don't have any means to just take advantage of them. I'm not a believer in that. And I think this particular proverb speaks to that really well. And something we need to keep in mind is, what is our motivation for doing something? What is our motivation for hiring someone, or what is our motivation for offering someone what we're offering them. We don't want to be opportunistic on someone's disadvantages in life. That won't work out well for any of us if we decide to do that. So keep that in mind as you're kind of continuing your journey, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're a student or you're just kind of getting started in the game. And this is going to go into what I talk about in future episodes, which is being able to justify and have reason for the things that we're doing. And sometimes our motivations and reasons just quite frankly aren't good. Our motivations need to be seen through the lens of what is right and what is wrong. And can we explain why we're doing what we're doing with good moral intentions? So that's it for this week's episode of Theory of Why. And as we continue on this journey, we're going to have a lot more principles and concepts and stories. And that's going to be the flow of the show. I really like starting off with something in history. How does it relate to the topic? And then tying it into a business principle. And the cool thing about this is it's an open forum. So if you agree, disagree, think there's something that I'm missing, I'd love to hear it. You can go down to the show notes and review all the ways that you can contact the show. And I'd be glad to answer your question. And even if it's disagreeable, talk about it on air. So that's going to wrap up episode 1 of Theory of Why. I appreciate you all listening, and we'll catch you on next week's show. Take care.